One of the great pleasures of my journalistic life, I'm now a recovering journalist. I have my 30-day chip. We have support group meetings. Was being blessed with the company, being able to be in the company of President and Mrs. Ford on a number of occasions in the late 1990s and early part of the 2000s. President Ford was incredibly generous in talking to me at various points, some anniversaries. We had a conversation about the fall of Saigon, and I did his remembrance of that incredible moment, and he with characteristic generosity, wrote me a note, which I keep on my desk, actually, which refers to that as that saddest of days. And not many presidents who preside over controversial moments are actually candid about the content of those moments. There are not many presidents who would openly refer to something as in acknowledging its human and emotional content. And Gerald Ford was unquestionably in a very small class of American presidents who called them as he saw them and saw them right a heck of a lot more often than he didn't. And so we honor his service and the legacy that you all are so wonderfully continuing here. And I just got to say it, boy, could we use him right now. It's really remarkable. I've been out for 3 or 4 weeks now talking about Jefferson. And one of the first questions, there are 2 questions you get right off. One is people say, well, a lot's been written about Jefferson. And I say, wait, I was misinformed. This isn't the first book? Like Rick in Casablanca. And the second question is, what can we learn now? What would he do about the fiscal cliff? And so, well, you can't really rip him out of context. But I said, not too long ago, in an era, President Johnson, for all his manifold outsized characteristics, shall we say, one thing about politicians is they're all like us, only more so. But not that long ago, a single man rose to the presidency because of his capacity to act in a principled, pragmatic way. I mean, the rise of Gerald Ford to the presidency is a remarkably American story of the centrality of the virtues of acknowledging that you might not have a monopoly on truth. And to take, and what I love about President Ford is he is a master legislator, was master at pushing us through helping us lead us through the Cold War and the most remarkable economic expansion in history. Remember, the building of the American middle class after 1945 was the single greatest moment of the spread of opportunity and the creation of wealth for the broadest number of people, including the spread of liberty with the civil rights movement, really that the world's ever known. Even after Gutenberg, it took a long time. That was a burst of creativity, and Gerald Ford and his generation were right in the middle of it and pilots of it. But sometimes you have to do things that aren't all that necessarily popular. Compromise often gets you through and maximizes your popularity. But what President Ford did when he truly ended the long national nightmare in September of 1974 with the pardon that I think unquestionably cost him his job in 1976, was one of the 2 great moments of utter political courage in the last quarter century. The other, I believe, was George H.W. Bush, who broke his no new taxes pledge and memorably said, it's no longer read my lips, it's read my hips, as only he could do. Read my hips. And he knew then. He said in his diary that day that he had probably lost re-election. Gerald Ford, with the pardon of his predecessor and the attempt to start a new chapter in American life, George H.W. Bush in an attempt to impose a fiscal discipline that did not last, and that the consequences of which we are living with right now, also did that and lost his job. And I wish we had more people now who were willing to make those kind of existential choices. And so it is with enormous humility and gratitude that I'm here today. I always start in talking about Thomas Jefferson by pointing out that there are some things that are perennial in life, and partisanship is one of them. So I want you to put yourselves, if you can, in New York in 1790. Thomas Jefferson has just returned from France as the American minister. He has become the first Secretary of State. He's moved to the capital of the new nation in New York. He could not find rooms, as he put it, on the Broadway, so he had to take rooms on Maiden Lane. And he immediately goes to war with Alexander Hamilton. And they are, as Jefferson put it, daily pitted in the cabinet as two cocks, constantly at each other's throats, debating fundamental questions and not so fundamental questions. Again, politics doesn't change that much. Jefferson used to be driven crazy because Hamilton had a separate channel to the British diplomats. And, you know, for those of us, this may be true in some of your lives, that it's the smallest of bureaucratic annoyances that loom largest. Even at the creation of the country, basically, people were throwing fits about not being the first to know something in a chain of command. So they're debating fundamental things, they're debating little things. It's driving George Washington crazy. So Washington writes them both a letter, asking them to knock it off, historiographically speaking. Washington writes a letter to Hamilton and to Jefferson. And he says this: "How unfortunate it is that whilst we are beset on all sides with insidious friends and avowed enemies, that we are being torn by internal dissensions that are tearing and harrowing our vitals." Tearing and harrowing our vitals. There are a couple of things about that phrase. It's very vivid, it's tactile, it clearly shows that Washington cared deeply about what was going on. It's also memorable. Not a lot of phrases that George Washington ever uttered were memorable, so it's a unique thing there. Here's how well it worked. Jefferson wrote back about the illegitimate son of Nevis, Alexander Hamilton: "I will not suffer the slanders of a man whose history, from the moment at which history can stoop to notice him, is a tissue of machinations against the liberty of the country, which has not only received him and given him bread, but heaped its honors upon his head." So that Dr. Phil moment didn't quite work out. Hamilton wrote back saying that Jefferson was a fanatic in politics and an atheist in religion. And in that era, in that moment, an anonymous letter writer wrote to Jefferson, "I think you ought to get a damn kicking, you redheaded son of a bitch." So, I know a lot of people want to think that Karl Rove started all this. I know that Karl Rove wants to think Karl Rove started all this. It's been with us forever. Partisanship is a perennial force in the democratic experiment. Jefferson shared briefly the founder's vision that there would be an amalgamation of parties. By the time he had been president for about 2 or 3 years, he gave that up, saying that men had divided themselves into parties by differences of opinion over whether the interests of the many or the interests of nobles should predominate, since those questions convulsed Greece and Rome. So Jefferson looked all the way back and saw this as a perpetual issue. It could be managed, it could be ameliorated. That's what Gerald Ford did. It's what George H.W. Bush did. It's what Dwight Eisenhower did. But it could not be done away with. Because if we don't have conflict that breaks along partisan lines, that means we're in an absolutist society. And the central work of Thomas Jefferson's life and the ongoing work of everybody in this room is to continue to ensure the survival and success of a Republican, sorry, lowercase r, experiment in self-government. And we forget sometimes how remarkably new that idea was at the time of the American founding. Now, I want to be clear. I don't think the founding should be used as a historical antidepressant. I don't think that because nothing can happen now, we should look back and just think, oh, if only we could be like them. Because you know what? We're a lot more like them, and they're a lot more like us than either side would probably like to think if they could. What we have is a culture of contention, and where greatness lies, where political greatness lies, is in the banking of the fires of that contention. Because you're never going to put that fire out, because if you put that fire out, that means we all agree, which in your heart of hearts, you know we never will all agree. What it means is that we either have a king or an absolutist culture, political culture, that enforces the sense that we all agree. So unless you want a monarchy or a hereditary aristocracy that totally agrees with you, we have to live in a partisan world. We have to find a way to manage it in a 60-40 kind of way. And life, at least my life, and I suspect yours too, is kind of about 60-40. Sometimes there are moments where there is a 100% call. President Ford's call in September of 1974 was one of those. President Bush's in 1990 was one of those. FDR's in 1940-41 was one of those. Abraham Lincoln's was one of those. But those are the moments that are the exception to the rule. And we are incredibly lucky when we have the right people in the right place to make those calls in those exceptional hours. The greatest politicians, the greatest presidents, are the ones who can do both, who can manage and govern in seemingly ordinary times by making the deals we have to make to keep the Republican experiment going, and yet have the capacity, when the crisis comes, to make the hardest calls of all. And the presidents we talk about and the presidents we remember, and that one president whose legacy clearly is so alive that he brings you here now in President Ford, are those who can do both. Can you make a list of great American presidents who did not combine these two things? A skill of articulating an ideal, a vision of where the country should go, and yet also had the capacity and the legislative and deal-making skill to bring that ideal closer to reality. They're two very different skill sets. Visionaries are philosophers, they're preachers, they're professors, due respect. They're not necessarily politicians. Politicians know how to trade horses. They know how to trade bridges, sometimes to nowhere. They know how to make things work. They're two different things. A lot of really good legislative mechanics around, a lot of good visionaries. It's when you get someone who bridges those two human capacities. And Thomas Jefferson, I believe, was the greatest such figure in the early republic. At the time of the Revolution and in the tumultuous years that we don't spend as much time with, because I think the popular historical memory tends to go from 1776 to George Washington. You might stop briefly at Andrew Jackson just for a moment I'd appreciate it if you would. We Tennesseans have had a rough time recently in presidential stuff. All the way, and then you get to Lincoln. And it doesn't help that Lincoln now looks like Daniel Day-Lewis. That's not helping my guys. Best thing that ever happened to Abraham Lincoln was having Daniel Day-Lewis. But Jefferson was there managing those two skills and able to do that. And so I want to talk about him as a politician for a minute. And I want to think for a second about why is it that he resonates so? People don't talk this way about John Adams or George Washington or even Alexander Hamilton. I want to point out, by the way, just for the record, that my guy didn't get shot in Jersey. So there's that. The critical question is what makes a historical figure endure? And Jefferson, a 19th century biographer, once wrote, if Jefferson is right, then America is right. If America is wrong, then Jefferson is wrong. Now think about that for a second. That's a hell of a burden to put on one person. You don't hear it about Washington. You don't hear it about Adams. You don't hear about Hamilton or Madison. But you do hear it about Jefferson. And so why? My theory is that it's because we either consciously or intuitively understand that Thomas Jefferson represents the best of us and the worst of us. He articulated a promise of human liberty in the middle of a revolutionary struggle that we continue to fight to fulfill. And he was hopelessly hypocritical and failed miserably to bring that promise into full reality. He was, in other words, a human being. I believe that the characters, the figures who resonate, are not those whom we see bathed in a heroic light, but those we see in daylight. To continue this series of metaphors, I believe that we learn more from people we try to look in the eye than if we look up at them uncritically or down on them self-righteously. The best of Thomas Jefferson was that he did not believe the life of the mind and the political life of the nation should be separate. He was coming of age at a time when century upon century upon century of the assumed authority of priests and princes was falling apart. For millennia, people were expected to accept what they were told on faith as revelation or as coming from a divinely ordained king. The work of the scientific revolution, the work of the European and Scottish Enlightenment, was to flip that round, to take, and the work of the Protestant Reformation as well, to flip it around in a way that suddenly, instead of the focus of existence being on those in authority, the focus became on the individual. That suddenly we were in charge of our own souls, of our own destinies. We could choose our own economic path. We were not trapped by the circumstances of our birth. That was the Enlightenment idea. Now, unquestionably, in that era, we're talking about white people. We're not talking, they were not broadening it to all women. They were certainly not broadening it to slaves. That was all part of the painful, bloody, but ultimately redemptive process which American history has unfolded. But we can't judge them by our standards. That's not fair. So it's remarkable enough what they did in that moment. And Jefferson believed that these ideas weren't just for a university. They weren't just for William and Mary in Williamsburg, where he was. They weren't just for the University of Virginia, which he created. They weren't just for the salons of Paris, where he was. They weren't just for after the political session ended in Philadelphia or New York or Annapolis or Baltimore or Princeton, where various congresses met, or Richmond. They were for every day. They were for every moment. Because the American experiment was about giving political manifestation to these ideas. That if a people did not think for themselves, a king or a dictator would soon step in and think for them. History was full of this. America was the exception, not the rule. No republic had survived. Look at Rome. Jefferson said that men should be participators in politics not only on election day, but every day, and that those who did so would rather have their heart plucked from their living body, rather than submit to a Caesar or a Bonaparte. It's a vision, a holistic vision of politics and public service. You can't outsource the political life of a community or of a country. It doesn't work. And once you outsource it, it tends toward an absolutism of the people who pay the most attention to it. This was a fundamental Jeffersonian insight. And so he wanted to make a world where those ideas could go into action. Something else that was hugely important and very much resonates, I think, in the life of President Ford. Jefferson believed intensely in the idea of sociability, that you and I had to, if not love each other, I don't want to get too weird, we had to like each other. We had to believe that our fates were linked. Because if we didn't think that, then why would I pay taxes for your kids to go to school? Why would you pay taxes to take care of my health care? Why would any of us give money to guarantee the equality of opportunity for someone who needed it if we had already taken advantage of it? How do you make a democracy work if we don't see that a rising tide would lift all of us? The great American promise is of human equality, but it's also of equality of opportunity. And you only are going to support someone else's equality of opportunity if you believe, if you like them, if you believe in them, if you see a common human bond. And this isn't some sort of 4th of July thing. This is deadly pragmatic political business. Jefferson totally believed in it. In a very specific level, he believed in it in Washington. Every night during the congressional session, he had congressmen down to dinner. Every night. He would write his daughters beforehand saying, I'm about to become an unpunctual correspondent because he was about to go into this zone. But he believed that if other lawmakers, other stakeholders, as we would call them now, in the system, if they heard his program from him, if they came to like him a little bit, then they might, on the margins, support him. And politics is decided on the margins. It worked in many ways. John Quincy Adams said that there were many critics of the Jefferson administration who had been silenced because the doors of the president's house had been so open to them. There's a wonderful story about a Federalist senator from New Hampshire who came down to Washington in 1803 believing that Jefferson was the devil incarnate, because you had to believe that as an article of citizenship in New England in those days. It's a little like, just quickly, that the same held true for Andrew Jackson. It is said that in the middle of the 19th century, a New England Sunday school teacher asked who disobeyed God and conceded to gave in to the serpent. And the school child immediately said, Andrew Jackson. So they've had some problems up there. We need to work with them on it. The senator came down from New Hampshire, hating Jefferson. Spent 6 years doing this round of dinners and being with Jefferson. By the end of it, they're exchanging pecan recipes. They're handing each other seeds. They're talking about how their grandchildren will swing from the limbs of trees built by this great relationship. It's sociability. It was Jefferson making himself not a distant character, but a real figure in the life of that political culture. And it's not just about the political culture, but it's about all of our communities, all of what Edmund Burke called the little platoons. We have to be engaged if we want all of this to work, because otherwise history tells us it's not. And that's not a homily. It's just a historical reading of what's happened in the long history of the world.